All right, welcome back to U.S. History lecture videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. So today we're covering the lesson Impact of Expansion on Chinese Immigrants and Hispanic Citizens in the American West. So U.S. history. By the end of today's lesson, you should be able to describe the treatment of Chinese immigrants and Hispanic citizens during the westward expansion of the 19th century. So Chinese immigration to the United States started slowly in the 1820s. In 1849, there was only 650 Chinese immigrants in the United States, but the gold rush drastically increased immigration. By 1852, there were over 25,000 Chinese immigrants who had arrived. So in a 3-year span, right, we go from 650 to 25,000, heavily in California, um, arriving via ship, so kind of crossing the Pacific Ocean. By 1880, there were over 300,000 Chinese people in the United States, mostly in California. And the main reason that they were attracted to America or immigrated to America during this time was mostly the gold rush. Many Chinese immigrants planned on coming temporarily, but that ended up staying long term for a variety of reasons. Many Chinese immigrants actually ended up helping build the first transcontinental railroad, and they often received the most difficult and dangerous jobs, facing harsh discrimination and violence from American settlers. But they stuck it out. They continued to arrive seeking better lives for their families. So, again, kind of a carrot and stick factor here. They were leaving a rough life behind, trying to make a better life for themselves. And so, despite the discrimination they faced in America, it was often still a better chance than where they had come from. Most of the Chinese immigrants were male. In 1890, less than 5% of the Chinese in the United States were female. Um, most didn't intend to stay permanently in the U.S., so they might have left their families behind and were sending back money. Many used this credit ticket system to pay for passage, and so then they sort of borrowed in order to get over there, paid off their ticket, and then they were forced to stay due to a lack of funds to actually get back home, which is terrible. Um, the discrimination against the Chinese immigrants was put into law. In 1790, a law was passed that prohibited the Chinese from obtaining U.S. citizenship. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act banned Chinese immigration for 10 years. And so after that huge wave of Chinese migrated to the United States, they actually passed a law banning immigration from China for 10 years. And then that act was extended multiple times until 1943, when it was finally repealed. So from 1882 to 1943, the United States banned Chinese immigration. So Chinese miners or railroad workers or whatever they were doing for work had to face a lot of discrimination. Um, the Chinese immigrants who chose to mine were forced to pay additional special taxes that other people didn't have to pay. They were often forcibly relocated into Chinese districts, and there was actually anti-coolie clubs formed by white Americans, which were anti-Chinese clubs. There were organized boycotts of Chinese goods, lobbying for anti-Chinese laws, and even a massacre in Wyoming. We'll talk about that in just a second. So lots of violence and discrimination against the Chinese. They had the deck stacked against them from the minute they set foot on U.S. shores. So the 1885 Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming happened because in the 1870s, white Americans were forming these anti-coolie clubs, and coolie was a racial slur directed towards people of any Asian descent. And these clubs, they used to boycott Chinese-produced products and lobby for anti-Chinese laws. Now, some of these protests turned violent, and in 1885 in Rock Springs, Wyoming, tensions between white and Chinese immigrant miners erupted in a riot, resulting in over 24 Chinese immigrants being murdered and many more injured. And unfortunately, of course, minimal consequences for this. So, situation was tense. The California Constitution of 1879 denied naturalized Chinese citizens the right to vote, prohibited them from holding state employment, and further restricted rights and opportunities for Chinese immigrants. So discrimination was law at both the national and the local level. The Chinese people and communities banded together. They created social and cultural centers in cities like San Francisco. They provided services within their communities, such as social aid, education, places of worship, and healthcare facilities. And they stuck together to take care of themselves in the face of these hardships. Many Chinese immigrants were stuck in the lowest paying jobs or working in menial conditions, competing with white Americans for jobs in California cities. Um, and that ultimately led to even more tension and discrimination. And so you can just imagine the long term effects for the economic challenges that these Chinese American families had, right? Again, they're fighting to make a better life in a world where the deck is stacked against them. But the legacy of Chinese immigrants remains. They helped build critical infrastructure like railroads, contributed to agriculture, especially in California, and established vibrant communities and cultural traditions. And many of them stayed. They stayed for many generations, forming towns and communities that influenced American culture and still remain today. So discrimination continued well into the 20th century. The Chinese Exclusion Act was not repealed until 1943, but Chinese American communities persevered and continued to grow. So you can consider the challenges that were faced by Chinese immigrants and think about their contributions to American development, right? How underrated um, how underrated all of the work they did to build America has been. All right, and the last few slides today are Hispanic Americans in the American West. So kind of briefly touching on how westward expansion affected them. So kind of shifting a little bit further south, we're going to focus heavily on New Mexico, which, believe it or not, was the center of settlement for many Hispanic Americans. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War in 1848, promised U.S. citizenship to nearly 75,000 Hispanics who had been living in what was now the American Southwest. 90% accepted this offer and chose to stay in the United States, even though they were immediately relegated to second-class citizenship status because they were Hispanic Americans rather than white Americans. However, those who settled the area were proud of their heritage. They developed ranches of great size and success, and despite promises made in the treaty, these Californios, as they came to be known, quickly lost their land to white settlers who simply displaced the rightful landowners by force if necessary. So we've got Hispanic Americans becoming American at the end of the Mexican-American War, in which America required more territory from Mexico, and so that territory, instead of being Mexican, became American. So people residing there in the part that is now America became American citizens, but were discriminated against heavily. They were successful in settling and developing ranches, but then that land was often taken from them forcibly by white American landowners with no repercussions. In a few instances, frustrated Hispanic citizens fought back against the white settlers who dispossessed them. One instance is a group known as the Whitecaps or Las Gorras Blancas that tried to reclaim their land and intimidate white Americans to prevent further land seizures. These Whitecaps conducted raids of white farms, burning homes, barns, and crops to express their frustration. However, their actions never resulted in any fundamental changes, and ultimately, several of them were captured, beaten, imprisoned, and the group slowly disbanded. So in California and throughout the Southwest, this massive growth of Anglo-American settlers simply overran the Hispanic population that had been there for generations. And so despite being U.S. citizens with full rights, Hispanics quickly found themselves outnumbered, outvoted, outcast by a corrupt, partly corrupt America. So Hispanic Americans, just like the Native Americans and the Chinese, suffered the fallout of white settlers' relentless push west, even though Hispanic Americans had been there much, much